Hello, Matt here from RetroOnly.com. Today we will be talking about why a Sega Saturn has a cartridge slot. Before we get into that, be sure and hit that like and subscribe button below. Do you own a Sega Saturn and just realize that there is a cartridge slot as well as the normal disk drive? Have you ever wondered what that slot is for? Maybe you were just now looking to buy a Sega Saturn and realize there is still a cartridge slot even though the console plays CDs. Well, in this video, we are going to explain what that slot is used for and why it is there. So, why does the Sega Saturn have a cartridge slot? The Sega Saturn has a separate cartridge slot along with a usable game drive to expand the RAM capacity and game data. The Saturn offered an internal RAM of 2 megabytes, but for some bigger games, users would use the slot to increase the RAM. If you still have questions or want to know more about the slot, you will definitely want to keep watching. So, what is the Sega Saturn? The Sega Saturn is a 5th generation video gaming console that was developed by Sega. It was released in 1994 in the United States by Sega. It was released after the incredible success of the Sega Genesis, so a lot was expected out of it, both from the console and from the games as well. The cartridge slot. The Sega Saturn was actually an improvement over the existing console that offered no external storage capacity features. With the help of this external storage capacity, the game save data could be stored externally on the storage unit. It also provided game enhancement features for its users. It was recommended for the people who preferred to optimize their big games so they could be run smoothly and without any malfunctions. An improvement over the Sega Genesis. Sega's previous model was the Sega Genesis, which proved to be a commercial success for Sega. Although it had no feature for an additional add-on or external cartridge drive, it worked pretty well because the games at that time were very simple. Over time, the game quality improved, so consoles with higher storage capacity were needed. This is where the Sega Saturn came into play on the market. The Saturn, in contrast to its prior version, offered an external memory cartridge slot so that additional game data, save data, and sophisticated storage space could be added. Advanced features. Most of the games around that time were still very simple, but there were a few games that required separate storage. The original Sega Saturn package did not offer the external cartridge included, so it had to be bought separately. After a little while, it began to come with the games, as well as all the new Sega Saturn consoles that were sold. Multiple external vendors also developed and sold this hardware for permanent storage space, and it usually came with large content games. The Sega Saturn's advanced aspect was that the data was continuously saving on the cartridge for larger games. So whenever the Sega's power cord got accidentally unplugged or the power went out, all the data would still be available on this external storage cartridge. This feature was one of the most amazing things that gamers loved about the Saturn. Storage capacity of the cartridges. Since these cartridges often came with different games, their memory was adjusted according to the game specifications and supporting requirements. However, most of the external slot cartridges that came with games were about 4 megabytes in space. This space was double the size of the built-in internal storage on the Saturn. People mostly use these for the high-quality games such as Street Fighter, X-Men, Capcom, D&D titles, etc. Other consoles followed the same pattern at the time, where multiple types of adapters were created to increase the storage capacity of a console. Futuristic approach. This approach was considered a futuristic approach by many people, since it had many enhanced capabilities. The problem was that these slots were mostly used for games, instead of increasing the RAM running speed on other consoles, so that did confuse many people. Versions of the external cartridge. Sega Saturn offered 2 different versions of this external cartridge. Those were 1 megabyte external cartridge and 4 megabyte external cartridge. The 1 megabyte external cartridge was able to enhance the gaming speed and performance at a maximum of about 1.5 times more than the original rate. On the other hand, the 4 megabyte external storage cartridge was able to speed up the performance and quality at a maximum of 4 times more than the original RAM speed that the Sega Saturn offered. Because the 4 megabyte cartridge was a lot better than the 1 megabyte one, it was considerably more expensive. Problems related to the external cartridge. Although this external cartridge slot was an official release, it was only originally intended for the consoles in Japan. This meant that it could not be used for the Sega Saturns outside of Japan. This became a big problem when there were games made in the US that were bigger and needed the external storage cartridge to run properly. To run these cartridges, an outer bypass was inserted into the same storage slot. This bypass would allow more than one cartridge to be inserted into the console at the same time. Games that required the external cartridge. Capcom and SNK became the external publishers for these cartridges. They used to develop these cartridges for each individual game with unique game posters of equal size printed on it, so it looked official. Many games actually required extra storage space. While some ran on the 1 megabyte extra storage space, others required the 4 megabytes of extra storage space. The list of some of the games that required these cards are X-Men vs. Street Fighter, Groove On Fight, King of Fighters The Best Collection, Real Bout Guru Densetsu Best Collection, Samurai Spirits Zankuru Musoken, and Marvel Superheroes were just a few. This external storage cartridge is a must for any gamer who wants to get the maximum output from the Sega Saturn console. One of the main reasons why this console was never the big seller for Sega was that it had these type of issues. Although there were many successful Japanese games made for the console, the games never reached a lot of success as they could not be played anywhere but in Japan. So let's wrap it up. Now that you know why the Sega Saturn has a cartridge slot, you can accurately help your friends when they have questions about the Saturn. You can also explain to them everything else you learned in this video, from what size cartridge was needed for different games to what specific games needed the cartridge. Even with all these issues, the Sega Saturn was a gaming console that quite a few people still ended up buying. Since there were only a few selected games that required the expanded storage cartridges, it was not that big of a deal to the majority of gamers. Because many gamers just avoided those games that required the cartridges, they still will have good memories associated with the Sega Saturn, instead of all the issues that some people had with the console. This has been Matt from RetroOnly.com.